There's also a very strange sculpture of a Bishamon 10 where they're back to back and their backs are joined to each other. The next is Jikokuten, Celestial King of the East, guardian of the nation. The name says it all. He's a protector. He protects the country, protects the state. Here you can see he's standing on a little bit more of a three-dimensional representation of the demons. They seem to be raising him off the ground, holding him up, so to speak. And the role that he often plays to the east is he's the most warlike of these. He carries implements of war in both hands. He'll carry a sword and a spear. Sometimes he'll carry only a sword, but the other hand will be on his hip. He'll wear a helmet of war sometimes, not all the time. I have to sort of cover all my bases because you'll never see one hard rule. He's not often depicted outside of the Shiteno, the four. If you see one celestial being, if you see one Shiteno standing alone, it's most likely going to be Bishamon 10, because he's the only one worshipped independently. The other four, or the other three, you will only see them in conjunction with the Shiteno grouping. Yes?
When was Jikoku-ten introduced? Or?
So the entire grouping of the Shiteno were introduced very early when Buddhism came into Japan, especially around the time of Shotoku Taishi. Shotoku Taishi actually prayed to the Shiteno that Buddhism would become a religion of Japan. Because there were two factions. There were the anti-Buddhist faction and the pro-Buddhist faction. Shotoku Taishi was on the pro-Buddhist faction, and so he prayed to the Shiteno that they would be able to defeat the anti-Buddhist faction. And when he was successful, when he was victorious, he built the Shiteno-ji that you can see in Osaka. And so that was around the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 7th century. Yes?
Is the fact that Bishamon 10 is the only one of the 10 that's worshipped separately solely due to the fact that he's part of the 7 good luck gods? Or?
No, that actually came after. The fact that he became one of the 7 gods of good fortune came after the fact of his sort of supplantation of the Taishaku-ten. Because of the massive role that he played in defending the northern continent from evil, and the fact that he did such a good job with it is why he sort of became the chief of the deities, supplanted Taishaku-ten, and then became named among the 7 gods of good fortune. So Zokoten is the celestial king of the south. He's a lord of expansion. It is, when you pray to Zokoten, you are essentially praying for the expansion of your mind, so that you might achieve enlightenment, that you might be able to wage war on the evil thoughts and your inclinations that keep you from achieving enlightenment, and Zokoten is one of the deities that will help you do so. So Zokoten does not look very different from the others at all. And there is no real hard rule as to which deity carries which implement. And so they are, again, not interchangeable, but they are very easy to confuse with one another. And again, you have to look at their placement to really determine if the tools are the same in all of them. Again, usually he's carrying a spear or a 3-pronged fork, and the other hand is on his hips, but not always.
Question about
Yes.
the sculptures. How large are these pieces that we're looking at?
So some of them are small enough to be in a home shrine. So some of them might be anywhere from 10 inches to 2 feet. And some of them, there's one on display at LACMA right now that is 9 feet to 10 feet tall. So some of them you might be like life size, some might be larger than life, and some might be of a size that makes it easy to keep in a home shrine. Yes?
Were these created in Japan or were they imported from another country?
So these, the grand majority, almost all of these were carved in Japan itself. Because of the limited ship space and stuff like that, you wouldn't see a lot of sculptures carried over from China to Japan. More often you would see diagrammatic drawings upon which these sculptures were based, coming from China. Kukai and Saicho, who were sort of the founders of esoteric, or I wouldn't say founders, but the carriers of esoteric Buddhism into Japan, they had just boatloads of these diagrammatic drawings. Yes?
About the armors, the statues, or
Yeah.
are they accurate depictions of, say, Chinese armors
Yeah.
in a particular dynasty?
So that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but it does look like an armor that would have been Tang Dynasty and onward from there. The elaborate armor type at least looks like something that would be produced by a dynasty over the time. Yes?
Do we know who any of the sculptures are?
So a lot of the sculptures that we're seeing would be dating around the Heian and Kamakura period. That's when you see the most prolific carving of sculptures coming out of Japan. During the Muromachi and Momoyama periods as well, you see a lot, but it starts to go on a decline. If somebody thinks differently or knows differently, please feel free to correct me.
Do we know who any of the sculptures themselves were, or are they just anonymous?
So a lot of these sculptures, if they were done in the late Heian to Kamakura period, they would most likely be hollow. And when you go inside a hollow sculpture, there would be inscriptions inside there, and you could usually find the date. So the Bishamonten sculpture that is in Lakma right now, if you walk around the backside, you'll see a little hole on the back. And that's where a camera went up inside. And they were able to see the entire sculpture was filled with inscriptions that talked about the date when it was carved, who the head priest of the temple that was given to, who the carver was, who the designer was, who the painter was. All of these details are on the inside of the sculpture. Yes?
How is it known that all of this was inside the sculpture and you should drill a hole into it?
So some very brave soul decided after some x-rays and stuff like that, that they were able to determine that there was writing on the inside. And that's when, with the permission of the proper authorities, they were able to take it apart and look inside. Since the earlier times when you actually had to take it apart physically, when cameras were developed, they have since been able to make non-invasive, well, I can't say non-invasive because you're still going inside it with a camera. So it is not as invasive as taking it apart. You're going inside with a camera and a light and you're shining around to see. But it's x-rays that mostly would unveil the surface. Yeah. Yes?
So these are assembled?
Not all of them. Some of them are solid, and some of them are assembled.
Get the writing inside.
Yeah, so some of them are, it's a technique called Yoseki Zukuri, which is joined block technique. And you're taking multiple pieces of wood, and then you're joining them after they've been carved. I can go on an entire tirade if you'd like me to, but we do have to get through all the information here. Komokuten, Celestial King of the West, Lord of Expansive Sight. He wants people to keep an eye on the mind, the growth of their own knowledge, the expanding of their Buddhist practice. And he is probably one of the easier ones to identify because of the implements. He carries a brush in one hand and a sutra in another hand, but not always. Thank you, thank you. Sometimes he'll carry a spear and he'll have his hand on his hip. So again, it makes it very difficult. But more often than not, you will see the brush and the sutra. The brush and the sutra. Any questions from there? Which brings us to the next grouping of deities. These are other celestial beings. They are Nio. They derive from temple guardians of Jain temples, Buddhist temples, Hindu temples, known as Dvarapala. Literally protectors of the law. And they are placed on either side of the entrance of a temple, and in order to deter any sort of evil from entering that space and to keep it a good sacred space where Buddhist practitioners or Jain practitioners or Hindu practitioners are safe from evil and from interruption. So they are often these monstrous looking beings, ugly faces, misshapen torsos, carrying weapons of destruction or weapons of war, like a club or a rather vicious looking sword. Sometimes they'll even carry stylized thunderbolts themselves. Thunderbolts are indestructible. They basically blast your mind of any sort of evil. So a thunderbolt is an auspicious symbol to be carrying. So one of the Neo you will often see when you're walking in. I think the most famous pair you can see at Todaiji. You'll hear me say that name a lot during this lecture. They were carved and they were placed on either side of the entrance. These are massive sculptures. They're 12 feet to 15 feet tall, carved out of wood, beautiful musculature. They're carved to be very vicious looking. So the one that you would see on the right-hand side as you enter, remember that in Japanese and other East Asian languages, you're reading from the right to the left. So that's an easy way to remember it. You have Agyo. Agyo is the beginning, the start, the birth. A is also the first letter in the Japanese alphabet. And so that is sort of a little bit of a clue as to who this is. When you say your mouth is open wide. On the other side, so these are other depictions of Agyo as well. You can see in every single one, he's got his mouth open. And quite often, not always, but quite often, he is depicted with no shirt on, to show off the musculature, the rippling muscles, the sort of the threat of violence, so to speak. On the other side is Mishaku Rikishi, who is also known as Ungyo. Is the last letter of the Japanese alphabet. And when you make the sound, you keep your mouth closed. So the hint, Agyo, mouth open, Ungyo, mouth closed. And Ungyo is often seen with his mouth closed because it shows that from the beginning to the end, from birth to death, from the alpha to the omega, all those things, it shows that they protect against all of it. That's what the representation of the first letter and the last letter represent. Now there is actually an apocryphal story attached to Kongo Rikishi, to Agyo. There was a king who had a son, and he named his son Kongo Rikishi. And the historical Buddha was going around preaching and giving his sermons, delivering his sermons in different areas. And so Kongo Rikishi realized, and he saw that sometimes the Buddha would be given a hard time. Sometimes there were people who would be treating the retinue of the historical Buddha poorly. And Kongo Rikishi, he decided to use his physical strength and his, I hesitate to say it, but his quickness to violence, he used it to benefit the Buddha, basically to be his bodyguard. And you can see, again, most of these are depicted without shirts to show off the rippling muscles and the potential of violence. One other thing Agyo, he represents sort of dynamic violence, dynamic power. And Eungyo, he more so represents latent power, potential power, violence that could come out at any minute. Agyo, on the other hand, is dynamic. He is going to enact violence on anybody who would threaten the Buddha. The last grouping of, so I do want to say that there are vast amounts of celestial beings, and I'm only covering the main groupings in this talk, because there's no way I can cover hundreds of celestial beings in a single lecture. So the Juni Shincho are also known as the 12 divine generals, or the 12 celestial generals. And the number 12 has any number of meanings. It's the number of months, it's the number of daytime hours, it's the number of the different directions, it's the number of the animals in the Chinese zodiac. The number 12 has so many different meanings. And it's the last grouping that I really want to focus on, the fact that they are affiliated with the animals of the Chinese zodiac. So you can see in their hair, in their crowns, they have a little animal that correlates with one of the animals in the zodiac. So this one would be a horse. This one would be a
Mouse.
rat. Yep. This one would be a
Dragon.
dragon, absolutely. And this one would be a snake. So the 12 celestial generals, the 12 divine generals, they actually came fairly early on in the history of Japanese Buddhism as well. They came during the Asuka Hakuho period, and they would have been 12 protectors of Yakshi, the medicine Buddha specifically. And you would pray to this entire grouping, Yakshi and the 12 divine generals, for healing. And there's even an apocryphal story, again another one of those, that these 12 deities are responsible for defending the 80,000 pores in your body from diseases from entering in there. Now, you asked a question about when we would identify these. So one of the cheats on how to identify the age of a sculpture is you look at the eyes. So most often you see crystallize in late Heian and Kamakura period sculpture. Muramachi Momoyama after that as well, but most commonly you would see Kamakura period and Heian, late Heian would have crystallized. That's the end. I hope you learned as much as I did.